So,
Great.
awesome.
We are actually just going to introduce ourselves, and we're going to stand so that you can hear us because you can hear better if we stand.
Oh, and I forgot. Shannon is a lip reader, so make sure that she can see you if you have a question, or otherwise she won't hear you.
Okay, I'm Angie Fenimore. I'm a New York Times bestselling author. I've signed 6-figure book deals, landed top literary agents, and I also run the Calliope Writing Coach programs, courses, conferences.
Right. I'm David Powers King, author of science fiction and fantasy, and also a certified substance use disorder counselor, and hoping to drop 2 books to my agent this year.
I'm Cody Langille. I write horror, dark fantasy, middle grade fiction. Member of the Utah chapter of the Horror Writers Association. Been in the military for over 18 years.
Hello, my name is Shannon Babb. I write historical natural disaster fiction and disabilities fiction. I'm also a professional curriculum developer.
My name is Peter Orullian. I'm mostly known for epic fantasy from tour books. The most recent thing I did was write a novelization. My favorite band is a band by the name of Dream Theater. They wrote a big epic double album, and I got to write the novel to that. And then I've got a big announcement that I can't share with you yet. It'll come probably next month, so I'll let that be a teaser.
Okay, so I'm just going to start with a seed question, and anybody can answer this. And I'd actually like to turn it over to Q&A pretty quickly because I think you guys know what you want to ask better than we could put together seed questions. So the first question is, why are believable emotions important to a story? And I would say also, how do we get that right and how do we mess that up as authors?
I'll go ahead. Do you want me to stand when I talk to this too?
I'd prefer it if you guys are okay with that,
Yeah,
but
sure.
It's okay to sit. It really is, but it just makes a difference. Well, that's to record sound for the recording, so it's not actually amplifying voice. I just want to make sure everybody can hear.
So believable emotions are really important because if you don't write something that's believable, your reader can't connect with your characters. And you really need that reader connection to get buy-off on your main characters. Because if they're not connecting with them, they're not going to care about them, and they're probably going to put your book down. So that's why I think it's important to have believable emotions in there. It's like a core part of any story, regardless of any genre, right? And that's how we connect readers to like alien races and fantasy races and things that are different than us. We give them those same emotions so that we can at least connect to them on that level.
I would. I thought a lot the same thing as I was walking over here to this panel, but I inverted it. I think in order for the emotion to be believable, you have to care about the character. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I wrote one of the first novels I wrote was a horror novel, and the very first scene was a scene of two military guys in the Vietnam War, and they were in an early firefight, one was down and ended up dying. And I thought it was a heart-wrenching scene, and I was bringing a whole bunch of information from my research to it that helped to evoke that for me. And I know it did the same for some veterans because I had some Vietnam vets read it. But in some of the readings I had from just lay readers, it wasn't really connecting. It was so early in the book. Anything about the character, there was no reason to care, even though death is heart-wrenching. A counter example to that is, do you guys read the Harry Dresden novels at all? Oh yeah. In Grave Peril, very early in the book, they go and they're basically going to try and rescue a bunch of babies. That's a little bit broader example because most people can stipulate to concern for a child. And so there's an emotional investment immediately around the urgency and the concern for the life. I don't suggest you all put babies in peril in your opening chapter of your book. But I think what's key, at least for me, is that the emotions become, I think, authentic when you're invested in the character. And it's a challenge to do that on page 1. And another example is the opening of Da Vinci Code. The very first thing you see is a museum curator who's been sort of splayed out and killed. You don't have a lot of sympathy for that character yet.
Great. Shannon, David?
So I find that whenever you're writing things involving disaster, or you need to give some setup. I agree, you really need to get to know the characters before you put them in peril, because they don't care. And I know the first couple of times that was a mistake I made, because again, when you're writing these characters, you already love them. You need to make them lovable to your readers.
So I'll stand up for this one. So in my practice, when I'm meeting with clients in a group setting for substance abuse, we usually begin with a warm-up exercise called check-in. And in this check-in, we go around the room and ask everyone 2 questions. How are you feeling today? And then once they answer that, we say, why are you feeling that way? And the reason for that is because many times with our clients, they've gotten into substances or gone into dependence because they wanted to stop feeling something, to stop feeling their discomforts in life, the things that were not working out for them. They just didn't want to feel that anymore, and so they would use. And the reason why we do that is to help them get back in touch with their feelings. So it's usually when I ask this question, first off, I guarantee you 95% of the time I get, I'm good. All right? And I'm like, well, okay, good's great, but it's a category. There's a much broader, basically good is an umbrella for a much broader vocabulary of feelings. And so I try to get them to say something a little bit more specific. And then I ask why, and that's actually usually a very difficult thing to answer for them. Half the time they don't know why they're feeling the way that they're feeling. And us as authors, if we're also writing characters and we don't understand what they're feeling or know what they're feeling or what they're going through given their situation, that also makes it hard for the reader to connect with that character or characters. And so one pitfall that I was very much guilty of when I first started writing was that I used the word felt a lot. Sally felt anxious. All right? If you're using words like that, like felt, to convey your emotion, that's very quick and dirty and really kind of sets up not very much action for your reader to get involved in. So rather than just telling us how someone feels, think rather, what is the person doing with their body language? Actions speak louder than words. You can say that Sally felt anxious, or Sally curled up in her bed and started to cry, holding onto her teddy bear like it was the only thing keeping her connected to the world. So I'm just throwing that out there.
And I'm going to answer it too. So people who are reading or experiencing fiction, whether you're watching it, you're reading it, whatever it is, they must be in the skin of the character. We all know this, right? And how to do that is by coming from the senses. When you write, you're writing from the senses. What are they experiencing? So as a writing coach, almost always when an emotion lands flat, we don't care, and it looks trite or corny or contrived, the problem is upstream. It's not actually in that moment so much as it is, did we get into the character's skin? And then, it's that toy from the 70s that was banned? Clackers, I'm talking about, those glass balls with the strings, you went like this, and they went all the way up and back, and they were, many of us got concussions. So this is just science, okay? For every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction, right? So you want to accomplish this actually in writing emotions. So it's about what your character is experiencing, okay, the clackers, and then what your reader is experiencing. Those two things, you want to match them. So if you're writing from what your character is feeling, like, oh, he sobbed, oh, he this, oh, he that, you're robbing the reader of this experience. So you set up the experience of it, and you tell it from the senses so that the reader has that emotion. Because your job as a writer is not so much for your characters to have these emotions as it is for your readers to have these emotions. Every great storyteller is writing their manuscript from an emotional arc. They're painting an emotional picture. That is what fabulous storytelling is. Bottom line, it's all about emotions.
can I add a couple of things?
Yes, you can.
One of the best things I ever heard is that characters are what they do. And so, and I would couple this with another concept which is called information flow. So if early in a novel you have a dad comes home and there's a letter there and maybe it's a foreclosure notice or he's been laid off from his job. You don't ever have to say the word angry or frustrated or mad. You could have him do something that exhibits that. But what you wouldn't want to do is immediately, I don't think, go back into why his reaction is so strong. Let that sit with the reader. It's an understandable thing, right? And you understand the emotion. Later in the book, and this is the information flow part, later in the book you might find out that he's always suffered with the concern of being able to provide for his family. And that for him, ultimate failure is the loss of that job, which meant, money in the bank, mortgage payments, food on the shelves. Could have been that his father was a poor provider, and he made a vow he would always be sure his kids had the things they need. So that one moment, which had such a strong reaction, is like a reader hook that later in the book can pay off in these moments where you start to reveal the backstory. And that information flow thing can be very, very powerful.
Great. Anybody else want to add anything?
Can I?
Yes. Will you just stand and say your question loudly? And
Oh,
there.
not a question. I just wanted to
Thank
add
you.
to that because I thought when you mentioned the Dresden novels, I thought you were going to go to when his daughter's at the top of the stairs and he's been avoiding her. But it was set up throughout his whole history. So when you mentioned that, I started thinking how important setup is for an emotion because by the time he sends his daughter away for, like you're saying, the setup of that is, then he's got, he doesn't want his daughter around because he's trying to protect her, et cetera, et cetera. Probably many people have read the books, we get it. But when his daughter starts questioning him, starts, "Are you Harry Dresden?" Like, I was tearing up because of the setup, because I knew who Harry was. So I think there might also be like two aspects. You need some emotion to get people to care about your characters. But then once they've got that, there's so much more emotion you can get later by playing on who and what they are and what's most important to them. Because he was an orphan, he orphaned his daughter. He was, the whole setup.
By the way, you don't have to have that all figured out. Some writers do, and that's great. But you can set those story hooks and just know there's going to be a moment when that character is going to feel, you're going to explore the deeper impact and resonance of that moment. And you can figure it out later and just trust the process. It's okay not to have it all figured out. That's just the difference in writers.
And
Some
I would
writers
add
are
to
the
that.
plotters and some are the...
Yeah, I would add to that, and I'm totally a pantser, but I plot. But I would add to that, you can write the story forwards and backwards. You can go back and forth. You can make sure that you have all those seeds after you sort all that out. You don't have to get it down. Write a draft, get that draft done, and then make sure that you've landed all of those elements that create impact for the reader.
Yeah, there's a lot of times that I won't fully understand some of my characters until I finish that first draft. And then I really understand, okay, this is where they were going and what they were doing. I can go back and fix things if I need to.
And if it really helps for a point of reference, go ahead and just say what the emotion is that they're feeling at that time and move on with the rest of the story. You can always come back and replace that word with more detail.
I use placeholders. Every car is a red Corvette. Every character, I don't know who it is either Dr. Kathy, Colonel Kathy, Teacher Kathy, whatever. Just placeholder and move on, because it will happen when you're going back through the story and seeing where to land that impact. Okay, so what do you see these days in what you're reading or what you're writing? How do we mess this up? And how do we do it effectively?
How do we mess up effectively?
Yeah, or that too.
Because none of you guys have ever done that, right?
Never.
Well, I'm going to respond. I'm going to be a bit controversial here.
Okay.
I think of novel where every emotion, you avoid the word and you avoid using language like felt, is going to start to groan under the weight of your effort to try and absolutely describe all of the movement and everything. So it's the same thing with was. You're going to hear people say, you never use that, you never use the passive. there's a place for everything in language. So you just be judicious as you're writing your book. The example I give here is any of you read the Alex Cross novels by James Patterson? Patterson, a quick context on this is Patterson, when he started writing the Cross novels, what he did first is he wrote a really, really like skeletal draft of the book. And when he got finished and he read it back, he's like, wow, that goes fast. Kind of like it. So he basically left it as it was. And that became the template for the Alex Cross novels. Now, of course, he's now like a machine doing crazy things with how he collaborates. But those, for the first many years, those Cross novels were wonderful, I think. And Patterson would do something interesting. If he had a character, if he had an Alex Cross going across the lobby, he would do something like he said he crossed the lobby. And he knows you all know what a hotel lobby looks like. He doesn't need to describe it to you. There's no need to do that. I use that as an example for there will be times I think it's okay for you to use the shorthand for the emotion, because that may not be the most important thing at that time. I know that this is a panel about emotion, but I would hate for you all to go home and just labor so hard over every time a character feels emotion that then I'm basically reading this and it's just groaning under the weight of because how many times are you going to say he got white knuckled and before it's just going to be silly, right? So all the advice is good, but it's okay to be judicious in how you're going to talk about emotions. Sometimes it's sufficient to say the character was just damn mad. And I'm glad to have rebuttal on this.
So I have a question about writing in first person. I struggle with this because if it's an authentic teenager, I'm writing young adult, I think a lot of them speak this way. Oh, I was so mad. That's what they're really thinking. But I'm told that, to make that come across, you need to say things like, my face turned red, or but not, you can't say that because she doesn't see her face turn red, right? So you have to show it in actions. But the artificiality of that sometimes seems really odd to me in first person. You understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So do you go ahead and do, rather than saying, oh, I was so embarrassed, you say, I can feel the heat rising up to my ears, that kind of thing. How do you accomplish that in first person and not have it sound like an author writing something that a teenager would not think or say?
Well, I don't want to just feel like I'm talking too much, but how I would parse what you just said is, you described a moment where the character was relating how she felt, which I think she would say, I was embarrassed, versus the character experiencing the emotion, which may be would be exposition versus, actual quoted language.
Take advantage of the rant. Quite honestly, that's one of the things that teenagers are really good at. And the teens are going to relate to that. And oftentimes when they're really angry or they're really emotional, they'll go back to those really simple words and add really interesting modifiers to them to describe how they're feeling. And you might have their speech break down as they're describing how angry they are. And then they can describe some of the feelings, like what does their stomach feel like, and those types of things to help deepen the emotion for the reader.
Okay. So something to keep in mind.
Almost like the Yosemite Sam effect.
So something to keep in mind is that you're actually impacting your reader. So it's sometimes more powerful to have your characters say or do nothing, because the reader is having the experience for the character. So, in order to land a punch, you got to go like this, right? So it's in the quiet, it's in the hushes where a lot of this happens, because otherwise, if you don't go like this, you're going like this. Good luck. Good luck with impacting anything like that, right? So sometimes it's in the silence, right? And definitely when you're building that story, you've got to have this emotional roller coaster. So you have to have the valleys to have the peaks. Nobody wants to get on a roller coaster, go straight to the top and just go around, right? Okay. Did Peter or David, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
So
No, I agree with
I
what
meant
Angie
Cody,
said.
I'm sorry, Cody. Yeah, not like I want to shut you down, Peter.
No, I just agreeing.
So yeah, there's definitely a careful balance you have to play in. Like when I first said avoid felt, for the most part, that's what I would suggest. And every once in a while, it's okay to just say it for how it is. Because, like Peter said, if you like write a novel where it is like 100% like, I mean, descriptive to the point of poetry, some people might feel like that's way too hard of a thing to read. You know, you're kind of arching over your audience at that point. So there's a balance to be had, and it's important to find where to best place that description, or where a shortcut may be more appropriate.
That's actually why I can't read Stephen King anymore.
Yeah.
Because he goes really in depth on things.
Okay, Cody, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Just
that?
to the first person
'Kay.
question. The cool thing about first person and also like third person deep or close is you can get inside that character's head. You know, you're going to know their thoughts and reactions, emotions. So, you know, I think it's okay for them to say I was embarrassed or even think that, but it might trigger a memory or a feeling they had from something earlier that might help you with what you're trying to portray, instead of just flatly saying I was embarrassed. I'd be careful with flashbacks, though. They tend to slow things down, but I think every now and then it works.
Awesome. Okay, so raise your hand if you have a question rather than a comment. We can all chit-chat afterwards. Question. So you first and then you, okay?
How do you balance self-awareness with emotion? To kind of elaborate, I wrote a book, a young adult novel, and when I was finished, I realized the characters were way too self-aware. They knew how they were feeling and how to describe it way too well. And it was a serious problem in the book. So how do you balance that out?
They understood themselves too well.
I see.
Yes.
And I was a beta reader, and it's like, teenagers don't necessarily understand themselves as well as you're portraying the kids in this book.
So this goes back to the reader, like being focused on what your audience wants to experience. Let them come to some conclusions. You know, don't write down to them. Don't tell them everything. They want to experience, like our brain doesn't know the difference between dream, reality, and imagination. The brain does not experience those three things differently at all. And they're on a ride. The reader's on a ride experiencing this. And readers are smart. Give them credit. You do not have to spell out everything.
I find that utilizing emotional fatigue can be useful, because oftentimes the character may not realize that they were on an adrenaline rush until it crashes. And so you can have the reader going along at speed with your character, and then everything drops out, and both the reader and the character comes to the realization, okay, I was running away from that monster, I was getting an adrenaline rush, and now I can feel really worried about things, and that panic can set in afterwards. So using the stages and allowing the reader and the character to discover what emotion they're actually feeling at the same time can be useful.
Does anybody have anything else to add to that?
I think it's just what's appropriate to the character. I think it would be actually really great to read a YA novel where in your milieu, maybe one of the characters is absolutely stunningly self-aware, and it's part of what defines that character as unique. But then, it's okay then to have those who are, and probably should, just for contrast, others that aren't so much. I just started watching, I'm on the last one to this party, but I just started watching Sherlock, the BBC one. And Cumberbatch, like, I love it, by the way, but it's, it's like, he took what Conan Doyle did, or the writers did, and put it on steroids, because he's basically a superhero. He is always so cognizant. And I'm not all the way through them, but I'm hoping they get to a place where they put him under enough emotional duress that he misses something. So I think it's okay. I don't know what your novel was like. If all of the characters were that way, then I think that's problematic. But I think it would be fun to read a novel like that, where one of the characters was so beautifully insightful about their own emotions. So don't throw that away, 100%.
And then I know this is about emotions, but this is important actually, is when you have people beta read your novels, you actually are looking for the empirical information. okay, rather than people's opinions, because everybody's going to have a different opinion. And you're not writing to one opinion or two opinions or three opinions. You actually want to capture the widest possible audience. So you want to ask them, hey, write down when you started, when you stopped, when you got up to hit the loo, when you went to go get kids, if you had an emergency, when you came back to it. Write down where you were. And then have all of your beta readers do this, because then you can compare. Did they all get up at the same time? I have a problem. Or was it different? Did they have different things to say? And have them read like they're readers, not like they're critiquing. Like they picked it up at Barnes & Noble, you know? And that'll make a difference for you in being able to determine what works and what doesn't work across the board. And you'll get more valuable information that way. Not to diss beta readers, just saying. That's the most powerful way to get what works and what doesn't work. Okay. Okay. Question?
So I struggle with, I feel like my characters are here, and then they're here, and then they're here. And because it's the words maybe I'm using to describe the emotions. And so, but I feel like if I'm doing mellow emotions, that it's not as interesting. So I guess how do you kind of transition and not, I don't know, does that make sense?
Is the situation around what's going on with the character in line with those feelings that they're having? Like, they're having this high, is there something that's contributing to that high? If they're having that low, is there something contributing to that low? Like, is that going on?
Yes.
Okay.
But then I also feel like they can't stay here for forever.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else have anything to add to that?
Just to kind of go along with what he was saying, you know, it's got to follow your story, you know. I write pretty fast-paced stuff, but I purposely add moments of downtime because I don't think the reader wants to stay ramped up to hear the whole time. So I'll ramp it up. It'll stay up here for a while, and then I'll purposely add a chapter where everyone can catch their breath, talk about a few things, kind of analyze what just happened, figure out a way forward. And it's at least to me and to my readers, it seems like it's a good enough transition for them to come off of that so that we can start back up again, right? I know a story is kind of supposed to go like this and then drop, but if you really look at a lot of stories, it's a lot of peaks going up to the top and then coming back down.
And you know, something else that really works too is to put all your characters on the same basic ride, like you've loaded them all on a roller coaster and they're in the same car. They don't all arrive at the peak at the same point. There's the first person and last person. But if you build it that way, then your story structure is a lot more sound. And so your reader isn't like all over the place either. Does that make sense? Okay. And there's a question in the back. Yes?
My question is for crying. I don't know if you've dealt with this already, but I had one reader kind of talk about, he kind of said something like, I think you only get like one cry per book. And I was like, really? Because I cry a lot. So do you have any sort of rules like that you follow with writing? Is how many times you're going to let your characters go to these extremes? Or is it just always what they're feeling as you go forward?
I think it's just what's in line with the character. I heard a writer one time on one of these panels say, "You never let a male character cry." I didn't let that go. I think it's just what's in line with the character. There's nothing weak about crying, and if you've got a character that weeps a lot, if that's consistent with that character, I think it's okay. So I would. The thing that bothered me most in your question is this idea of a rule. There's not rules, right? But what you're hearing up here is our best advice that you should absolutely filter and see what resonates with you as a writer. Try it, see what works, right? Because no one writer has the same process. But as far as the emotion and something like weeping, personally, I'm judicious with it. It doesn't happen often, but yeah, people cry, and they cry for different reasons. Like I blubber when I watch the show Rudy, the show Rudy, because this idea of someone who just is indefatigable to try and get what they want and finally has that triumphant moment, I just break down. My kids know it. I just blubber. Other people don't understand. They think it's a dumb football movie. So I think it's just whatever's consistent with the character, and understanding that your character well enough to know when it's going to be right to cry. I think that's all that matters. That's my opinion.
And then I have something to add to that about rules. And there is no hard and fast, like you get one cry per book or whatever like that. But you actually spoke to it, Peter. Like, you cry watching Rudy, but is Rudy crying? So you want to have the crying happening and the chills happening with your readers. And so if you withhold that, and then have it happen when it's appropriate, but withhold it, not in a weird way. It would be weird for somebody to lose, a main character and, love of their life and not have them cry. That might be weird for some characters. So you just want to look at the balance of it. But I get what you're talking about. It's that the reader doesn't cry. That's not always the case, but I reserve it till the end, is what I do.
I'll point out that, so the film Inside Out actually really kind of took to that rule, because we have this character, Joy, who cries one time. And it's actually set up very well in that regard, because here you have a character who's infectiously joyous all the time, but to actually make that emotion start to shed tears, it's like, oh wow, that's a really powerful moment. Even though parts of me is thinking, this doesn't make sense to me. But even then, if you pay attention to other parts of the film, the character's sadness, she's not crying all the time, even though that is her character.
She has a moment where she's actually joyful.
Mm-hmm.
So the contrast, it can be very powerful. In the example Angie gave, if a spouse or loved one dies, it might be really poignant to have that person not cry at the funeral. Maybe they do it in private, and you can explore that. Why would they not be willing or able to cry in public but can do it on their own? That might be some real deep emotional stuff that's worth plumbing. So you can use it effectively by just thinking about the when and the why.
Yeah, I know this dates me, but Ordinary People, the film Ordinary People, does this brilliantly. Our mother, the character Mary Tyler Moore plays, is setting the table, okay? And her son has attempted suicide and bloodied the carpet. That, if you want to watch something that really powerfully lands an emotional impact with the person who's partaking of the story, they're very judicious with the emotions. Okay. Did you have anything to
I
add,
have
Shannon?
one thing.
Yes, please do.
If you are dealing with a cultural touchstone, so something that people already have emotions about, for example, I've worked with a number of classrooms and they've written historical fiction about 9/11. It's something they do not remember, but everyone who went through it, we have very strong emotions, and they want to understand why we're emotional about it and what the history is. Characters are going to cry. They're going to have much deeper emotions when they're experiencing it as a group, and you may deal with a lot more tears or a lot more intensity in that situation.
Sure.
Good. Do you want to add, Cody?
Yeah, just one thing. People deal with stress and trauma differently, right? What makes one person cry may not make a dent on another person's emotions. For example, who here has played the game Last of Us? Yeah, it's a video game. It's like a post-apocalyptic thing. But the first opening scene of that is a father and his daughter trying to get away from this dangerous situation. And it gets to the point, here, spoiler alert, the daughter dies in the opening scene. And for whatever reason, that hit me pretty hard. And I started crying right there. And my wife's looking at me like I'm a freaking moron. And I'm sure there's been like a million people who play that game are like, oh, that sucks, or whatever, and moved on, But it connected to me because I just had, my daughter was 2, I think, at the time. And I connected with that character thinking, well, what if that was my kid? And it got me right there. So something kind of cool to play with is if your scene's going to elicit emotions from your characters, and one character's going to cry, it may be cool to have another character there and see how they deal with it, that same event that just happened. So.
No game has made me cry like The Last of Us did. That's a good game.
Yes. Play that game.
Okay. We have a few more minutes. Any more questions? All right, let's go here and then here. Okay.
So how do you deal with the write what you know thing? Like if a character's in a situation and you've never experienced that, how do you, first of all, decide what would they actually be feeling in this moment and then portray it realistically?
Well, something I do is interview. I always interview. I call it going to the scene of the crime, basically. I have to experience what it is that I'm writing about, for sure. And like, for example, I'm working on a novel now that has a scene where one of my characters passes out in the Walmart next to the rotisserie chickens, okay? So it's played as comical, but it's also heartbreaking at the same time. Well, one of the things she's dealing with is that her husband cheated on her with a stripper, okay? And then this person in line that actually like is standing over her and checking her pulse and stuff is a nurse / stripper, okay? So I call my son, who's a nurse, and I ask him, okay, what would you do if you were at Walmart and somebody passed out? Would you have your stethoscope? And he gives me all the information. I've got a client who's writing a detective story. So I have him interviewing actual detectives so that it's realistic. So I'm clear, I'm not the end-all be-all. I am not the font of all knowledge, but I'm going to go to somebody who would know, and I might actually interview a few nurses. Like my son said, it depends on the nurse. Some might carry a stethoscope, some might not. I would, you know? So, but that works for my story. I can have that character be the one that would carry the stethoscope. So that's what I do. It's effective. Anybody else?
I read a lot.
Yes.
I find a lot of old journals and read accounts of people who have been in that situation, and sometimes you're reading between the line. The other thing I like to do is watch the news that was going on roughly that time. So you can read old newspapers and all of that, and it gives you context on dropping little hints on, okay, it was sunny that day, or it was rainy that day. And those types of things oftentimes play on your emotions, on your characters.
Something else I do is I binge watch TV like a crazy person. And I'm actually watching Happy Valley. I've watched season 1 twice in 1 week, the whole season, because I'm studying how, because there's never, once you think you know it all, that's the lid, okay, good luck, right? Because I'm studying this powerful character that is able to be actually kind of nasty at times, and we are so invested in her. How did they do it? And I analyze it. I have a client who's writing a fantasy novel, and we didn't quite have the punch at the end that we needed, and she's got the number 3 dealmaker agent waiting on this thing, and we're under a deadline. So what we did is both of us read the last chapter, like binge read, last chapter of the first book in the series for Lemony Snicket's Series of Unfortunate Events, Artemis Fowl, Sorcerer's Stone, and Fable Haven. And you know what I was able to determine reading them quickly like that is it's basically the same story. They all kind of have this character, and I'm not sure where it happens, they all have that fifth wall. You build a house like this, walls. They stand. If you put in a fifth wall in the middle that looks like it's a supporting wall and you kick it out at the end, very powerful. Looks like the house will fall. They all have this character, okay? Fable Haven, it's Lena, all right? That disappears, that you take them away, and then, there's I can't think, Gandalf, okay? Right? This is powerful. No 2 houses look the same, but they all have the walls that support the structure. So it's really important to look at the structure of it too, and to study storytelling. Yeah.
And if you're trying to convey things with which that you don't already have experience for, there's 2 ways to go about that. First is to go experience it yourself, but depending on what you're doing, I think most of the time that would not be helpful, or something that I would recommend doing. And for those things that are hard to do and probably wouldn't recommend doing is to do the research. There's lots of accounts out there of folks who have gone through situations that you have not. That you'd be very surprised. A quick Google search and you'd be amazed by what folks have put down there. Even one time I wanted to find out what it actually felt like to get stabbed. And I found someone's firsthand account of what their experience was with that. Surprisingly enough, they initially didn't think they were stabbed because the nerves were completely cut off and severed, that they didn't feel it at first until a few seconds later when they looked down and were like, oh my gosh, there's something in me. And then the pain started to set in. So that's my recommendation.
Okay, and there was another question that I already said you're next. Who was that?
She actually asked it first.
Hmm?
It was
Oh,
Okay, good. Okay, great. So does anybody else have anything to add to that?
actually, I'll throw one more to that.
Yeah.
So, for an example, I have absolutely like next to no knowledge about what goes on in like the drug underworld or like drug creation or anything, and I had no idea a year ago that I was going to be a substance use disorder counselor. But then I watched Breaking Bad. It's not an easy show to watch, but I think it's also an important show to watch because it allows you to be put into a lot of emotional situations with what's going on with people, and at the same time being in an environment where you can watch and not actually deal drugs or actually make drugs or actually feel for your life from the cartels, to be able to have an idea of what that's like to put into your stories.
The scene with Walter and the Jessica Jones character, the end of that arc, that was a big one.
That was huge.
Okay, and that was a good example of having your characters cry. Watch Walt's experience of that. He just like, he holds it in, but he does have an emotional response. He just killed a girl, okay, right? But in his mind, for the better good, right?
Jesse,
Yeah. Yeah.
probably a drug now.
Okay, so we have 3 minutes, 30 seconds of final advice from each one of our panelists. And you can just throw them out there as you think of them. I won't make you go in order.
There's a cool book out there. I forget the name of it, but if you come find me later, I'll have that information. I think it's called like the Encyclopedia of Emotions. Great book because it goes through all these emotions and disorders. Yeah, it goes through mental disorders, trauma, and how people typically react to those, and some physical characteristics they may manifest from that. Great book.
Awesome. Peter, Shannon?
Well, the thing that I've thought a couple of times during the panel is so many of the emotions are universal. You know, anger, loss, heartbreak. We trade on those as writers because they're common to us as part of the human experience. So I think you have a lot more sort of reserves in order to address those things than you think. But it's real work. You know, it's not like digging a ditch, but it can be painful to really get into the depth of some of those emotions. But that's the kind of risk you want to take as a writer if you're going to put something authentic on the page. So, for instance, if you've got a character who's going through the loss of a loved one, you maybe haven't experienced that, but the likelihood is that you have, and you need to be willing to kind of let all of that stuff come up. In my most recently released novel, I dealt with suicide, and I had to spend a lot of time thinking about a very good friend who did that, and that was very painful. Otherwise, though, I don't think what I would have put down would have been, right.
Okay, Shannon, David, 20 seconds each.
Okay, give your characters time to reflect. You can give them highs, you can give them lows, but they need space to understand what they felt in order for your readers to really connect with it.
And also, just bear in mind, too, that when we're feeling something, it's generally a response to something. So, if there's going to be an emotion, having something in place to validate that emotion is also important.
Clackers, okay? Clackers. And don't try to write and revise at the same time. The magic happens in revision, so don't labor over that first draft, okay? Okay, so do we turn it over to you, or can we give our panel a round of applause?
Yeah, let's get over our